How can the conjuncture of photography and truth be reimagined after the decline of belief in the veracity of the photograph and the crisis of truth more generally? The contemporary condition of the impaired truth of photography is not new, but recent events have reinvigorated the debate in new ways. I want to focus on how the non-diegetic and non-pictorial are taking on more of the burden and assigning truth and meaning to the photograph. In the 1960s and 1970s, the intellectual scrutiny of the constructed nature of the photographic document took place in the run-up to and aftermath of May 68. Photography within conceptualism had a tense relationship to the idea of the photographic fact. Its scepticism about facts usually had a low bar for what is considered construction and a high bar for what is considered fact. In this view, a statement is constructed if it presents a fact in a stylized manner. Facts come to seem very fragile because they represent incontrovertible truths, untainted by biased subjectivity and ideology. I want to think of facts instead as buried in statements and pictures and performances. Conceptual art interrogated the photograph in ways that both highlighted the document and the deadpan, but also treated photographs as constructed and ideological. If the advent of digital imagery cast doubt on the indexicality of the photograph, what are the chances of photographic truth in the age of fake news, post-truth politics and social media? There was a revival of questions of meaning in 2020 in populist conspiracy theories that spread doubt about COVID-19 and in disputes over Black Lives Matter and taking the knee, which amplified issues around truth, evidence, ideology, authority and disagreement. Also, if the truth ascribed to photography corresponds to a Western, universal, humanist epistemology, then can the truth of photography be reconstructed on a new basis that guarantees cognitive justice? Photography theory has challenged the established relationship between photographs and the truth many times, but COVID and BLM is less a crisis of the indexicality of the photograph than a crisis of truth itself, which presents a new crisis for the truth of photography. If we reject the post-truth epistemology of populism, but take seriously the critique of Western epistemologies, photography has a new place in the politics of truth. The problem of photography's truth arose primarily as a result of demanding that the photograph be the source of truth, rather than being itself subject to investigations into truth. I want to explore these questions by looking at different kinds of photographic portraiture. This is where the documentary tradition overlaps with Ariella Azule's contractual theory of photography, but also with different uses of portraiture in journalism, professional photography, amateur photography, art photography, social media, the mugshot, and so on. Azule's book, Civil Imagination, opens with a rich reflection on this portrait, actually a double portrait, Misha Kirchner's photograph, Aisha Al-Kurd and her son Yasir. Initially thinking that this image was an example of the aestheticization of suffering, Azule came to recognise that the scandal that attaches to the portrait of Aisha Al-Kurd does not reside in the photograph itself, but, as she says, in the fact that Aisha Al-Kurd's house was, and remains, vulnerable to the violent invasion of Israeli citizens in uniform. Azule uses the photograph of Aisha Al-Kurd and Yasir to outline a political ontology of photography that constitutes two encounters or two events, one in relation to the camera and one in relation to the photograph. She explains, I mean an ontology of a certain form of human being with others in which the camera or the photograph are implicated. Walker Evans' photograph of Ali Mae Burroughs has had many afterlives. Lucy Suter, for instance, comments that MoMA curator John Starskowski had a significant role to play in shaping a tradition from Paul Strand and Walker Evans to Lee Friedlander and William Wegman. One afterlife is Cheryl Levine rephotographing it in 1981. For a while, it seemed that Levine's photographs of photographs exemplified the nihilistic heart of postmodernism, as being, in Steve Edwards' words, fundamentally cynical to the claims that there is a world prior to the shutter. Another afterlife is Herman Scheiner's printing 26 photographs of it taken from a Google search of plus Walker Evans plus Cheryl Levine. Consider this portrait of Derek Chauvin that has been circulated widely within journalism and social media. The technique of extracting a portrait from a larger composition is demonstrated graphically in the opening sequence of John Berger's TV series Ways of Seeing. This technique is not only used in the conversion of a Renaissance painting into a postcard, but also by the police when they extract portraits of offenders from CCTV. In this case, the portrait of Chauvin is cut out of a still from the smartphone video taken by Dianella Frazier, documenting the murder of George Floyd on 25th of May 2020 in Minneapolis. When the footage was uploaded to social media, the death of George Floyd became the trigger for the most radical reconfiguration of the political terrain since the Arab Spring and Occupy. Derek Chauvin's prosecution and guilty verdict heavily relied upon photographic and video evidence, particularly the smartphone footage taken by Dianella Frazier. The long-term significance of this is yet to be determined, but it seems possible that the imagery of Derek Chauvin and George Floyd can have the kind of social effect that Mark Seeley credits to the publication of photos of lynchings as a rare and direct moment when photographs have generated real social and political change. James Allen discovered a gruesome visual legacy of white supremacy in America. Photographs and postcards taken as souvenirs at lynchings. The locks of hair accompanying some of the framed photos and the messages on the back of the postcards testify to the ways in which the photographs were encountered. Abigail Solomon Godot writes that everything from the acquittal of the LA police officers charged with the beating of Rodney Graham to the dissemination of the pictures of American soldiers' torture of prisoners in Abu Ghraib hinges on the claims of photographic truth. Or I want to say, the truth of the photographs turn on the ways in which different individuals encounter the camera and the photographs and how these photographs are circulated and used. George Rogers' photographs of the atrocities at Belsen were published in Life magazine in 1945. A whole page was devoted to one picture with the caption, "A small boy strolls down a road lined with dead bodies near camp at Belsen." The boy was a Belgian Jew named Sieg Mandag. The text accompanying Rogers' photographs in Life omitted this and other facts, in large part because the editors believed that the American public was anti-Semitic and they would have less sympathy for the dead if they were told that they were Jews. Here is the inverse case, an image of a mission. As Mark Seeley explains, American High Command specifically ordered that French African colonial soldiers be excluded from taking part in the victory parade through Paris to celebrate French liberation in August 1944. The face of victory over fascism in France had to be white. David Jackson, who took the photograph of Emmett Till in his coffin, was assigned to cover the murder for Jet magazine. Elizabeth Alexander's investigation into the historical precedents for the collective viewing of the Rodney King video describes the Emmett Till photo as consolidating the group identity of African Americans that shows how storytelling works to create a collective counter-memory of trauma. James Baldwin said, "It was myself in that coffin, it was my brothers in that coffin. I can't describe it so precisely because it had been so mutilated, it had been so violated. It was him, but it was all of us." Muhammad Ali said, "Emmett Till and I were about the same age. A week after he was murdered in Sunflower County, Mississippi, I stood on the corner with a gang of boys looking at pictures of him in the black newspapers and magazines. I felt a deep kinship to him when I learned he was born the same year and the same day that I was. I couldn't get Emmett out of my mind until one evening I thought of a way to get back at white people for his death. We broke into the Shoeshine Boys' shed and stole 2 iron shoe rests and took them to the railroad tracks. We planted them deep on the tracks and waited. When a big blue diesel engine came round the bend, it hit the shoe rests and pushed them nearly 30 feet before one of the wheels locked and sprang from the track. I remember the loud sound of the ties ripping up. I broke out running." The photograph of Emmett Till's open casket was disseminated to other African American magazines and newspapers at the time, but the mainstream press didn't reprint those photographs until 30 years later. When asked to explain her reason for painting the photograph of Emmett Till in his coffin, Schutz said, "I was interested because it's something that keeps on happening. I feel somehow that it's an American image." Hannah Black's call for the painting to be destroyed points away from the image to the significance of the non-diegetic fact of the artist's race in the political assessment of the work. Jamie Wagg's painting of Jamie Bulger was controversial in a way that the original photographic image never was. The scandal, therefore, cannot have been about the image itself, but only about the non-diegetic differences between two uses of the image. Talking about Wagg's painting at the time, Terry Atkinson said, "None of us like this side of our species' performances. We had much rather we had never heard of the Bulger murder. We wish it had never happened, much as we wish Auschwitz or Rwanda had never happened. But once it has happened, and once we know it's happened, then Goya's history dogs emerge once again howling from their traps." The relationship between the diegetic and the non-diegetic is central to the famous problem of photographing the Krupp factory. The solution to the problem of an image of a factory or any other complex social phenomenon is often reduced to the addition of a caption. My long-standing interest in text art prejudices me in favour of this device, but I'm more excited by Tretyakov's argument that the photo series or the photo montage lets us experience the extended massiveness of reality. Étant donné is a double portrait of Duchamp's wife and girlfriend. We can't see that from a photo of the door, but for many years a moratorium on photographing the piece was in place, and all we had was a picture of the door and descriptions of what visitors had seen through the peephole. As an art student, one of my art history tutors projected a slide of this door and spoke at length about the work. I can't remember if my tutor said that Duchamp had insisted that the work could not be photographed, or whether I assumed this myself, but I later discovered that it was the museum that made this decision, not the artist. In my mind, though, from that point on, this photo of the door to Étant donné was the photographic equivalent of Art and Language's early work, Map to Not Indicate. Map to Not Indicate, a work by Terry Atkinson and Mike Baldwin from 1967, violently but comically shifts the viewer's attention from the image to the text in a way that gives priority to the non-diegetic over the pictorial or even the indexical. It is an absurd combination because the caption adds nothing to the image other than what has been extricated from it in the first place. But for me, it became a model for thinking about art as something that has its strongest relationship to the world outside its frame. Instead of basing my critical photographic practice on the documentary photo and its caption, my model for the relationship between photo and world has been closer to the relationship between image and word in the recipe book. The truth of the photo of a pie is not guaranteed by being adequately amateur or de-aestheticized, but by being related to the ingredients and methods written up beside it. The photo of a pie does not tell you what is in the pie, the recipe does. The point is not to underline the significance of the caption over the photographic image, but to open the border between the artwork and the world in which it exists. This means not expecting the image itself to somehow replicate the indexicality of the photographic exposure to the world that it is of. Alan Sekula says that sailors and dockers are in a position to see the global patterns of intrigue hidden in the mundane details of commerce, but asks how to photograph what sailors already know. He begins with a cliche: a crate breaks, spilling its contents. But that's too easy an image of sudden disclosure, once archaic and cinematic, given that sailors rarely see the thrice packaged cargo that they carry nowadays. He chooses instead to assemble a story out of fragments. The documentary image that successfully captures a complex social condition is always charged negatively with what Sekula calls the archaic and cinematic. So long as the social condition appears to be condensed into a single picture, the real relationship between the image and the world, which is external to the image, is locked out of the image. The external world is highlighted, therefore, only to call the photograph into question. This is precisely what Victor Bergin does when he looks at this photo. Bergin writes, "Take the picture of George V on Derby Day. In this image, we believe that the contrast of rich and poor is made on the basis of a coincidence. The photographer just happened to be there. But it is equally possible, although perhaps less likely, that the two main elements of the image were assembled in the darkroom from separate negatives. Or again, it's not beyond possibility that the situation depicted was set up for the camera. For example, the photographer could have directed a suitably cast and dressed person to run up to the coach at a predetermined spot." This photograph by Alfredo Jar is related to a massacre committed during the 1994 Rwanda genocide. The relationship in question is that the eyes belong to a woman who witnessed the massacre in which her husband and two sons died. Bergin raises a familiar concern about this photograph, saying nothing in the work itself guarantees the factual truth of the image-text relation. The eyes could be those of almost any indigenous person from Africa or the African diaspora, and almost any story could plausibly be told about them. This photo was taken by Fred Morley on October 9, 1940, depicting a milkman carrying on amidst the rubble during the Blitz. However, decades later it was revealed that the image was actually staged. The milkman is not a milkman, but the photographer's assistant. During the bombing raids, the British censors were working desperately to keep the nation calm by forbidding to authorise images depicting the scale of destruction by the Luftwaffe. This photo can therefore be said to be false and constructed. Or we can say that the facts about its construction tell us something even more important about the conditions under which it was produced. Feminist art historians raised this question, the question of the non-diegetic, when they asked in the 1970s whether a painting has a different meaning if it's painted by a woman. This question challenges the competence of the aesthetic viewer, whose pleasure in art is based on forgetting that knowledge of art is acquired, as Pierre Bourdieu puts it. Forgetting here is the burial of truths, and the critical traditions of art history raise these truths to consciousness like raising the dead. Azule's brilliant social ontology of the photograph is used by her to shift the attention away from the meaning of the image to the power relations imminent to the uses of photography. I want to extend this social ontology so that the photograph is not only understood in terms of the politics of photography, but is located within the totality of historical and social life. That is to say, photography's relationship to the truth must take account of a wider ensemble of facts. So instead of thinking of facts in constitutive terms, as incontrovertible truths untainted by bias, subjectivity, ideology, and particular social or historical perspectives, I want to suggest that we characterise facts as buried in statements and pictures and performances that are retrieved by communities and movements in ostensive and pedagogical practices of looking. John Akomfrah is not only one of the great filmmakers of our time, but also one of the most profound thinkers on questions around montage. Here is a short example of how he speaks about montage. It's like taking a slice of this and then juxtaposing it in order to establish a relation to that. Initially, it felt like an approach rather than a technique. As I grew older, I realised that it's actually an ethic. It slowly dawned on me that this was about the way in which one accepted the coexistence of difference. Esther Leslie writes that S.V. Shub's archival work rescued fact from oblivion and made it speak again in a new context. In her use of archival and documentary footage, or what she called authentic material, Shub displayed her commitment to the fact. The second wave of critical modernist documentary extended and intensified the politics of the photographic image. Now, instead of photography being an issue within the revolutionary reorganisation of society, photographs themselves became the sites of struggle within the political project of the contestation of meaning. It's possible to see this period as characterised by the retreat of left-wing politics from the street and the factory to the gallery and the university. But it's also the period when politics extended to the home in new ways. So it's better to think about the academicisation of critical modernism as an expansion and legitimation of the struggle. However, it is noteworthy that the expansion that takes place is a transformation of official culture rather than the transformation of proletarian culture. As Sarah James puts it, Joe Spence combined formal strategies of estrangement with committed, collaborative and anti-hierarchical ways of working. For Spence, photographs were regularly combined with other materials, organised in sequences or included within larger dialogical and communal processes. Spence was involved, therefore, in an ongoing confrontation with photographs and the camera. For me, the non-diegetic conditions under which a photograph is taken constitute an additional set of facts that are not always known or legible, but are significant. This process of montaging diverse facts in time and space resonates with the theory of uneven and combined development which Steve Edwards and Gail Day have applied to the work of Alan Sekula. But whereas Sekula took his camera on trips across the seas, I travel from bookshop to bookshop in order to collect images that have travelled to me from all over the world. This is why my montages assemble different photographs together in a cluster of facts that are external to any one photograph.